Hello, I'm Kevin Chu, product manager in the release group. I'm talking with Andrew, who knows all the things about our feature flag capabilities. Uh, Andrew, we were discussing a proposal in a merge request, and I am lost as to what the proposal is about because I don't really understand how Unleash or how our feature flag feature works to begin with. If you don't mind just kind of walking me through the basic of the components that are involved and what they do, um, that'd be really helpful.
Sure. So some history about the MR is that for a very long time, when we GitLab developers want to utilize feature flags, we use a Ruby gem called Flipper at the base level. And Flipper is a very Ruby specific, database centric kind of Rails focused feature flag solution. But we also offer feature flags as a feature of the product. And there's always been this conversation around how we should bridge that gap and dog food our own feature flags, as that is a very important value that we like to hold. The initial dog fooding attempt has shown that there might be some concerns between how our architecture is set up and how the Unleash feature flag client works, and has made some cause for concern among the more performance-minded developers. So the way that the Unleash client works is that when you start, or at least the Ruby one anyways, because that's the one that matters for us. When you start your Ruby application, you tell Unleash kind of like what API endpoint contains your feature flags, and some other registration details. And every, I think, 15 seconds by default, it goes out, it makes an HTTP request, it goes out and it gets those feature flags and it updates its like internal store cache. And the fear is that the way we deploy GitLab would cause many requests against some sort of separate GitLab instance, like staging or ops, or like, yeah, one of those two, or even internally, if you do the HTTP request to yourself, we would end up DDoSing ourselves, which is not good. Or at the very least, significantly impact the performance of feature flag checks. And we want those to be as lightweight as possible, because the idea is the feature flag shouldn't impact the performance of the feature.
Sorry, one quick clarifying question for me. So every single time a user hits GitLab.com or whatever it is, there'll be a API call to GitLab to say, hey, I need to, this page is being requested. What do I need to show?
Yeah, yeah. So there's
client runs on our server, or
yes.
okay.
Yeah, so the client runs within our server. But we deploy GitLab instead as like a series of containers, right, that are spun up. So each container would have its own process managing its feature flags. So each container would then update its own feature flag store every 15 seconds.
Okay.
And that's kind of the major concern.
There's no centralized place where each instance of GitLab has its own copy.
That's right.
Okay.
Which would also, I guess, cause some consistency concerns. If a user hits a container that has not quite updated its feature flag store yet, then there's a chance that they might be like, they might not receive a feature flag that was on previously.
Right. And you said each copy each instance of GitLab updates the feature flag sorting every 15 minutes,
Seconds.
every 15 seconds. Oof.
Yeah. By default, which is, it's configurable, right? But that is a lot of like, it's a
Yeah,
lot
it's
of
a lot of,
requests.
yeah,
Yeah.
got it.
Uh, unleash the like reference server implementation that they've put out
Mhm.
heavily utilizes a concept called e-tags to get around this by, so the request comes in, but basically when the client requests the feature flags, it tells the server, I got flags that look like this. If nothing's changed, give me the new ones. And a lot of the times the server's just like, yeah, nothing's changed. And then I think also for their for their hosted solution, they scale in a way that where each customer gets their own kind of instance of Unleash, is my understanding, or at least like something similar, something kind of like that. So they don't have the same kind of scalability concerns that we do.
Okay.
So now this MR is an
Six.
approach
Yeah.
67377 is an approach to using our own feature flag, our own GitLab offered feature flags to control the experiments that the growth team runs. And it does that by circumventing most of the Unleash client. So instead of doing an HTTP poll, it just goes into the database, sees if there's a feature flag matching the name of the experiment and returns that. It doesn't have an internal cache, right? It just, every time the experiment is picked up, it goes and it gets the feature from the database. So there's no polling concerns anymore. There's no cache concerns anymore. Yeah, and it's a very small subset of the number of feature flags that we are developing with on any given basis. So I don't think there's too many experiments going on at any given point. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So a user hits a page, and that page has one of these experiments on it.
Sure. Yep.
And the server will somehow understand that we're talking about this experiment here. And then within that process itself, it's gonna go check, hey, should we return something? There's no self calling self via HTTP. It's all within the same request.
That's right.
And then that same request gets the information and then serves it back up to the user's browser.
That's correct.
Okay.
So it kind of kills a lot of the, it resolves a lot of the performance concerns, a lot of the extra trips that are needed. But it comes with its own set of potential issues, because it makes this component, this like experiment component very strictly tethered to our implementation of how feature flags work. So if we wanted to change something going forward, it would be a little bit more difficult. Or at the very least, we would have to heavily consider, I guess, how it would impact the process of this if it were merged in as is today. Yeah.
I think I understand.
And
Uh,
there's I
what
guess a
would you
little
do?
bit of uh there's some comments made that I do agree with, where you have to question whether or not it's actually dog fooding, because we aren't just using the Unleash client the way that we would expect our customers to use the Unleash client. We're like,
Because they won't have the same luxury of
exactly.
like, this is an experiment.
Yeah. They can't just like, they're not connected to GitLab in the same easy way. They can't just like reach into the database and pull out the feature whenever they need it.
Do you know
Um,
why the growth team doesn't just use Flipper for what they need?
they are currently. I think this was just viewed as an opportunity to be able to attempt to dog food, something that we haven't really been able to previously.
Got it.
Haven't been able to as much. There's the customers.gitlab project, which
Mhm.
does dog food feature flags for us. But certainly not to the same scale as if all of GitLab feature flags were running through Unleash, right?
Yeah.
Um,
At the core, like one thing it highlights is it feels like the feature flag server needs to be a completely separate thing from GitLab.
yeah,
Like it can't
yeah,
be the same thing because I mean, if we are ultimately successful and people are using GitLab for feature flagging of their own application, that's, I mean, it's it's going to be a lot of requests. And we're only talking about GitLab.com using this right now, and we're already concerned. It just doesn't
yeah.
seem like it's architected in a way where it's scalable at all.
That's been the concern of a lot of other team members.
Yeah,
I'm a little dubious as to how unscalable it is.
yeah.
I'm not 100% sure if there's been a lot of testing in that area. I'm just skeptical. I'm skeptical because,
You are supposed to be skeptical.
yeah. But it's not a concern to be scoffed at by any means. Like, it's a very real, it's something that needs to be looked at and investigated. I think if we do reach some sort of mega feature flag success, I could see there being the need for, my thought was always that there could be like an entity similar to the runner, where you can how you can very easily deploy a runner to do
Yeah,
your jobs. You could very easily deploy,
right.
I don't know,
It's
feature
something
flag.
separate where you can scale up and down
Yeah,
as needed.
yeah. So it would still like talk to GitLab, but it would be like one thing talking to GitLab for many things. So you kind of
Yeah,
can,
it's a one-to-many relationship between GitLab and
yeah.
the feature flag servers.
It feels like it shifts the burden around a little bit, and then it kind of helps, I think, in some potentially like hairy um enterprise network scenarios where, like, I don't know, a lot of the times, um you're if you're in like a self-hosted enterprise solution, you don't really want your GitLab instance to be talking to the outside world very much, or you want that limited as limited as possible. And then the same goes for your like deployed application, right? Like, those could be on two entirely separate network planes. And if they can't talk to each other, then how are they supposed to use our feature flags, right? Um, but then if you have like some sort of little deployable service, you can set up like a quarantined kind of machine that sits between the two and lets the communication happen in ways that are easier to know about and inspect and things. So I've always thought that that was kind of a good idea.
Yeah, it does feel like there's a difference between self-hosted and .com.
Yeah.
Because like self-hosted, this solution's probably okay as is.
Maybe.
At least a lot, the concern is a lot less.
Yeah. You don't want to also like cripple your self-hosted GitLab instance
That's
either,
true.
right?
Because the question of like how do you provision your infrastructure to run GitLab becomes a really different equation.
Yeah.
Um,
It's definitely something you have to consider. So I've always thought like some sort of little middle service would be nice. Unleash has kind of put one out for a very specific job where uh, if you're like on a phone or in a browser and you have only the phone client or the browser client, the idea of polling a server every 15 seconds for feature flags and doing that extra computation is kind of, it's draining on the battery. It's not very performant in the browser, kind of tough to recommend. So what they've done is they've put out they call it the Unleash proxy. I think I mentioned it in Slack at some point. And what that one does is
it's a
instead
cache.
of, yeah, so instead of the client doing all the feature flag resolution, right? Because the way that Unleash client works now is that you just get all the feature flags, and then when somebody is like, "Hey, is this enabled?" the server that is, or the client, I guess, figures out if it's enabled um, for whatever the inputs are, which is very different from something from how Flagsmith worked, right? Like when we were talking to Flagsmith, that was just they do all the resolution on their side. All you get in the end is whether or not something is on or off. And this proxy is supposed to act like that, where the phone or the browser can directly call them with all the data that they need to get all the feature flags all at once, and kind of not need to necessarily do heavy polling or any of that, or any heavy like computations.
Yeah.
It felt like a lot of
Uh,
talking.
no, I thank you. This is super helpful. My quick take on this is I generally agree. This like takes it in a very different direction, and not sure I'm comfortable with that, especially when we've explicitly said this is not a focus area for the time being.
Mhm. I think this approach can be made, the approach in the MR can be made to be a maintainable solution. Like I think it's not quite there, but I think there's some tactics we can take to at least uh, get it to an agreeably workable solution.
Yeah.
Um,
But at the
there
end of the day,
is,
this is like GitLab only, so it's not dogfooding our feature.
yeah, but we do have the customers dot project, and they do. So there, at the very least, somebody is. Just not gitlab.com. Um, I think it would be worthwhile to ask the growth team kind of what they would get out of using GitLab feature flags. Because I think, if I remember correctly, the kind of the big issue with Flipper right now is that there's no nice UI, so you can go and see all your feature
Yeah.
flags.
Yeah, he does talk about like the number one thing is to let a PM know,
Yeah,
hey, which experiments are rolled out. Like if it's all baked into the code, there's no,
yeah,
can't
yeah.
see
Like
any of that.
right now, the way we interact with Flipper when we're like rolling a feature flag out is we use chat ops, right?
Mhm.
That means sending like a, feels like an incantation as a message in Slack to See how things are going, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Cool. I'm gonna stop recording. Thanks, Andrew.
okay.